Hello, and welcome to the Sprint 169 review. The sprint ended on August 30th. It was a regular 2-week sprint. Let's get started. I'll start with an overview. Copy will follow up with the UI changes. Adam will give us some updates on the providers, and then I'll finish it up with the platform changes and the developer changes. Oleg is out this week, and he usually runs all the charts and scripts to build the charts. So we won't be having any charts today, but when he gets them finished, we'll have them up on the slide deck on SlideShare so you can see them afterwards. On the community side, Oleg put up a blog post of announcing the approach we're going to take for the Morphe release. Give it a read, but the summary is that what we're going to do is branch off of the Lasker branch. Master is a little too unstable, but we have a bunch of features we want to get out to the community, including new providers. And so what we're going to do is branch Lasker and do a sort of feature-only branch where we don't introduce too many backward incompatible changes, particularly schema migrations. And with that, that's the end of the community. I'll pass it over to Katya.
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. This sprint total 11 PRs got merged across UI repos, 3 bugs, 5 enhancements, and so on. Next slide, please. This is a bug when volume space is open from provider space. It is passing EMS ID instead of storage ID. Make sure you fix that here. Next slide, please. Here, non-English languages, whenever a field is changed in assign dropdown, below fields ID the selection, but that is broken. Fix that here. Next slide. Here, David converted data store, Pixie ISO data store and image forms to React. Next slide, please. Here, Mingxi converted action form to React. This particular form has like many subforms based on the action type selection. So it took some time to convert all of those. I think it has some 13 or 14 subforms. Next slide, please. Gilbert both my task and all task form to React. Yeah, next slide, please. This is an enhancement in service catalog page. For OVF template earlier, there is no data center dropdown. So in storage and folder, it is showing everything available. After this PR, data center is added. Storage and folder options are filtered based on the data center selection. Next slide, please. For this, I'll turn it over to Jason to explain.
Sure. So in the last sprint, myself, Joe Raffanello, and Adam Greer, we were working on an issue where the version of Uglifier and exec.js that we're using would cause a weird error when booting up pods, where it would fail, but then it would say OK and exit one. And we found that the latest Uglifier prevents that by delaying asset compilation. So the new upgrade should hopefully fix this. The only place we've ever seen this error is on a system that has Dynatrace installed because they messed with JavaScript. So most people haven't seen this, but if you happen to have Dynatrace, this should probably fix your issue.
Yep, that's all from UI. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. So this sprint in providers on Amazon, we added an enhancement to prevent service failures from services other than EC2 from causing refresh issues. We actually saw this on two different systems for two different reasons. One was lack of permissions, where they didn't really want to collect anything other than EC2. So the permissions that we got didn't have, I think it was CloudFormations, for example. And so that was causing the entire refresh to fail. When now, if you give limited permissions, we'll only collect EC, will handle any other errors gracefully. And so it's possible to restrict your permissions for managed IQ to be just EC2 if that's what you'd like. AutoSTE, they added a couple of supports features for some enhancements that they had done previously. They're working on adding this to the API and the UI for checking. So they added those supports features to their provider. They also added a new column to cloud volumes for health state, which indicates whether the cloud volume is healthy or not. For Azure, we added the Azure Kubernetes service. This is a of the Kubernetes provider. And so if you have your Azure credentials and you have an Azure AKS cluster, you can add that to manage IQ with your Azure credentials. Next slide. There you go. So these was introduced as part of some refactoring during this, some of these cloud-hosted Kubernetes clusters. There was an option to no op, which was being referenced where previously it was being ignored. And so it was just a missing variable name bug. But more interestingly, we added an enhancement to restart a watch at the previous resource version, unless it hits the specific error that indicates the resource version is no longer valid. So pretty common for cloud-hosted Kubernetes clusters is that you get a short-lived token, depending on the provider. You know, Amazon, it's down to, I think, 5 to 10 minutes in duration. Azure, it's like a month or two. But either way, it's very common that while we're doing a refresh or streaming refresh, the token will expire and we have to break out, re-authenticate, and then watch. Previously, this would incur a full refresh because we were nilling out the resource version and essentially starting from scratch if we hit any issues. Given that this is a more common thing on some of these clouds, cloud-hosted clusters, where we enhanced it to restart from where we left off, unless we specifically hit an error that says that resource version is invalid. So that's a nice performance enhancement there. It should reduce the number of full refreshes that we do. On OpenStack, Keenan fixed an issue where there are two models where admin state up in our database was a string, but it actually should have been a bool. So the column just had a T or an F as a string as opposed to a Boolean. This was preventing a couple of DDF forms from working on the UI side. So this unblocks some of the work to do DDF for network router and network ports. On VMware, we had an enhancement to use the guest full name. This is the name of the operating system, the friendly name, like CentOS 7, whatever. If the guest tools are installed and running, we'll actually pull the guest name from that as opposed to from the config. The reason why this is important is if you deploy a VM on CentOS 7 and then later you upgrade it to CentOS 8, the guest tools will report the correct updated operating system, but the config will have the previous one. So the config is not updated if you reinstall the OS on the guest. So that was a nice enhancement to pull the right version if you're not using Smart State. Next slide. Oh, okay, and I think that was one too far. Yep, there we go. Okay, so finishing up with IBM Cloud, Nasser has refactored the VPC connect method to better support services other than VPC. The reason for that is we are now collecting more information about cloud databases hosted in IBM Cloud. So if you want to follow that PR, you can see all the additional information that we're pulling. Jay has added targeted refresh support to the Power VS provider, and Nasser has added targeted refresh to the VPC provider. And if we go over to the next slide, we'll get a nice video demo of that. And over to Nasser.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so in this demo, you can see I'll be starting off with 4 instances in my inventory, and then I'll be creating a new instance on IBM Cloud. And so basically what happens is that as this instance is starting up, IBM Cloud's event handling service will fire off multiple events as this instance is starting. And basically on the MIQ side, we collect those events and then parse them. And then if there are any events that pertain to instances, then we just queue a targeted refresh for VMs. So this is good because whenever the status of a current VM is updated, the changes immediately on IQ. So yeah, so now we see that in the UI, the refresh was successful and that the VM is now there. And that's pretty much it. I'll turn it back to Adam.
Thanks, Nasser. So that's been coming along for a long time, but it's nice to see finally all the pieces come together and the targeted refresh support, the event handler and everything. Just really nice to see the whole thing come together. All right, and that's it for providers. Over to Jason.
Okay, on the platform side, Joe added a change to gracefully handle non-super users setting up replication. This is especially important if you're trying to use a cloud database service. Setting up replication requires super user, and not all services give you super user. So in those settings, when you're non-super user, the system will just gracefully not install replication instead of blowing up, which is what it did previously. Brandon added a change to enable HTTPD in the UI and API pods. These are two of the PRs. There's a number of PRs behind this, but ultimately it gets rid of some dependencies that we have within the code to turn on HTTPD when we're using UI or API. So this will just do it more at a system level. Keenan added a change to put our Ansible roles in a standard location. This moves us away from having a custom directory, which affects ultimately how we're trying to set up root or root access, or more specifically, getting rid of root access. Adam added a tool called memcached ping, which allows us to verify whether memcache is set up and what the latency is. So that's a pretty useful change. And finally, Keenan added an enhancement to limit the username of a user to 100 characters. We found on the back end that it was not being limited, and it should have been. Keenan, as Adam said, Keenan fixed an issue where the network router admin data column was a string instead of a Boolean, so he made a change to fix that. And a community user, Sprahaska, fixed an automated Git import issue when the specified branch was a symbolic ref. This is particularly important if you want to use something like a head ref, which isn't a which is a type of symbolic ref in Git, and it wouldn't work before. After its change, it does work. Some technical debt changes. I added a change to collapse the initial migration up to the Gaprindashvili release. This removed hundreds of migrations for very old versions. While most users probably won't know this, what this does do is speed up the boot usually of the application, because the orchestrator doesn't actually have to go through all of those migrations anymore. Keenan removed unused authentication fields. There was a number of fields from an old feature that was removed a long time ago that were in the authentications table that were no longer used. So he removed something like 30 columns that were not needed anymore. And finally, Brandon dropped MIQ Apache. This is the other half of his HTTPD in the UI change, where now that that is no longer being done, we can remove our custom Apache boot code that we don't need anymore. And finally, on the documentation side, Brandon added some documentation for doing an RPM upgrade. This was a long requested thing from the community, so now it's out there. This will explain how to upgrade major versions by just changing the RPM information on the appliance. And finally, on the developer side, Nick added a change to the cross repo tests functionality to retry ensure clone. Occasionally, a clone will fail just because of connectivity or something's wrong with GitHub. And this will add a retry to it so that it doesn't fail the entire run. And hopefully, if it can retry and succeed, then your run will just succeed and not fail. And that's it. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks to all the contributors and to everyone in the community. Our next sprint review will be on September 15th, 2021, and we will see you then. Thanks everyone.